I presented this slide with the breakout of my role, and they just cut straight to the chase. They just said, hey, if you're going to do that, like you're going to be bringing in a CEO, they're going to be hiring their own CFO, their own commercial officer, and then they're going to own all of this bit.
Welcome to the Startup CEO Succession Podcast, where we dive deep into the pivotal journey of founder CEOs who face the critical decision. Should you continue leading your business or bring in a new leader? I'm your host, Evgeny Shadchnev. As a founder, coach, and author specializing in CEO succession, I interview founders, chief executives, and investors who share their stories of navigating this transition. Today, I'm speaking with Henrik Hagemann, founder and ex-CEO of Puraffinity, a company on a mission to help 1 billion people have access to water free of forever chemicals by 2030. Henrik founded the business about 10 years ago based on the research he's done at Imperial College London. But in order to enable the company to get to the next level, Henrik realized that it would benefit from a different skill set, the one that he did not want to spend the next decade building. In our conversation today, we discuss how he came to this realization, how he approached the search for the new chief executive, and what's next for him. Enjoy the conversation. So, hello, Henrik. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Thank you for having me, Evgeny. This should be a fun one.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. So let's start by the founding story. Can you tell me about Puraffinity and why you started the business?
I definitely can. So we started Puraffinity back in 2014. It was one of these big research projects that got some initial momentum from a science competition. And then there was an interest, I think, in some of us researchers. We were only undergraduates in taking it forward for a commercial stage. So we presented this large project. It was at MIT that the presentation was. We were the Imperial College team. We got a few awards. We didn't win the big prize, so there was still a bit of a chip on the shoulder. And then we came back to UK, and in UK, some of the faculty at Imperial very conveniently organized some presentations where there was actually an investing body that came for one of them. And when they started picking up, oh, maybe you have something here, this one other team member, who was soon to be my co-founder, she was prodding me, saying, why don't we do this instead of doing the PhD, like the usual route? And after a few months of prodding, I started taking it seriously. We did a small pre-accelerator in 2015. And then in 2015, we decided to incorporate the company.
Yeah. So it really came out of the research that you started working on while still a student at Imperial.
Yeah.
And what does the company do today? What's the product?
So it's very simple. Puraffinity, we design these materials that can take out nasties in water more efficiently. So it might be a forever chemical to these Teflon chemicals that we then focus a filtration material on. So a bit like if you have an aquarium, you would have a little pellet at the filtration cartridge. We make those active components that go inside the big vessels for industry and also the small vessels for like a block of flats. And we try and make them more efficient by researching new ways of designing them bottom up instead of just taking something off the shelf.
So you help make the water cleaner on an industrial scale. So it's not for my kitchen, but rather for a block of flats or an industrial water production.
Yeah, it's very much focused on where we still need these chemistries for the net zero journey. So it could be a semiconductor plant, a firefighting foam application, it might be manufacturing of vaccines. These specialty things still require persistent chemicals called forever chemicals. And so we focus on making those customers responsible stewards and taking out these reagents before they become a toxic hazard for the communities that live around the plants.
Yeah. And you started the company, you said in 2015, right?
Yes.
Yeah, almost 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's been a long time.
It's been a long time. And you've been the founding CEO. Is that right?
Yeah, so when we set out to found the company, I remember in the beginning we put loose sort of roles around. There was the hacker, there was the hustler, and then there was the sort of in between. And I was very much the hustler, and the formal job title out of the group of us, I guess, was this founding CEO. And then I think it evolves once you have 10, 20, 30 employees to become more of like a genuine startup CEO rather than just a hustler who's like running around trying to make stuff work.
And can you say more about this transition? How did you experience this change from an early stage hustler with the title of a CEO to a startup CEO once you had a few dozen people in your responsibility?
Yeah, I think startups have several waves of learning curves, and so for me, one of the roles that changed the most is the CEO role. You go from being a few people around a round table, which we literally were in a basement at Imperial, to being a group of people. And the skill set that you learn through each of these waves is helpful to learn, but it's not always the skill set you need the most for the next wave. And so I was always very keen to try and plot out like what are the waves that I'm going through and talking about what are the behaviors that need to change from each of those stages. There's this really cool VC who came and presented at Imperial, and they talked about the go-to-market scaling. And basically, they talked about how you can sort of think about them as different Marvel figures. So in the beginning, you have this kind of like wild Marvel figure who's like an action hero trying to do everything themselves. And then over time, there are some evolutions, but eventually you become like a bit like that Marvel figure who sits in the wheelchair, who's like super intelligent, but it's kind of like you're running a whole university full of these individual like superheroes. And the waves that take you from that initial superhero stage to the university like professor stage, who's that one is in a wheelchair, they don't need to be operators themselves. It's quite gray in between and it's not always very linear. So that's what I think of with these waves.
And in your experience, what marks the transition between the waves? Is it about product market fit or the size of the team or something else?
I tend to come at it from a different angle. I think of what are the bottlenecks of the company. I'm always trying to tell my team, like, what is the bottleneck right now? Is it trying to get a product? Is it trying to get the stability of something working? Or is it going to market? And so we talk about product market fit really as a representation of what is the bottleneck. Once you get once you get product market fit, the bottleneck is how much you can sell of stuff because you know where to sell it. But before that, it's this kind of search phase where every company has a different bottleneck. If you're research led, maybe you know what the unmet need is, might be an unmet health need or industrial need, but it's very hard to get the technology to work for it. So actually, it's more of a technology bottleneck. If you're a SaaS play, maybe you have the tech. It's just you can roll it up with the turn of a button because it's all cloud enabled, but you don't quite know what the unmet need is. So I tend to think of, okay, what are the bottlenecks? And when those bottlenecks shift, then you might need a new set of people around the table. That's really, for me, the sort of trigger point.
And it's also a very nice segue to the main topic of our conversation, the new set of people around the table. You were the founding CEO, but you are not the CEO anymore.
No, as of 2 months.
Very, very fresh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but let's start a little bit earlier. What prompted the transition in the first place?
So we have to rewind 18 months at this point.
Yeah.
For me, I've always been very keen on doing 360 feedback. And so in 360 feedback, I got different themes. I have them here on my desk. And so it's always top of mind. And one of my themes is this eagerness to please. Another theme is trying to flex my style so that I use my intensity with the right set of people. And so I can be very intense. I do long distance cycling and other sports. I do the martial arts where the intensity bit comes out. But in work, it's always trying to modulate that. And so I do the 360 feedback to try and feed into these weaknesses that I have and see how am I doing right now. Is there too much intensity? Like the whole team is like, holy cow, he's too intense. Or is there too little? And the VCs are like, hey, you need to push. Now it's the time to push. And so 18 months ago, I did one of these 360 feedbacks that I do yearly. I tried to get a feel for what the behavior changes were. And I really saw a theme of me being more of a visionary individual and the integrator or the sort of operator aspect, which is about delivery. It's about churning out things on budget, on time, or on spec. That part, it's been okay, but it's not as strong. It's not like the running theme in all of my 360 feedback. So I use this 360 feedback to see and try and test with my individual report and my board members about this visionary bit. And it basically turned into this spark, which led me to look at splitting the role of the senior leadership individual, usually CEO, into two, where my thesis was I could operate better if I had someone who was through and through about delivery. And, they called it integrator. And so this is the entrepreneurial operating system. It talks about a visionary and an integrator. And I was like, I want to find the best integrator in the world. And if I do that genuinely, it's about doing what we've always done, which is optimizing for growth rather than for control. And so I was willing to give up my role, my title in the organization to find the best delivery focused individual as possible. And also, I guess, learn from them. So there's an aspect of recognizing that if I am the visionary, which my 360 feedback seems to say, and which maybe it's like, what's easier for me? Then I can probably learn a lot from someone who is like my opposite or like the opposite end. And so that became a board pack. I remember this board pack where I basically had split out my role and I presented this to the board without job titles, just saying, hey, I think this is what we need to do. And then we started having conversations around how we can do it. That took about maybe 6-8 months before it came to like, okay, let's talk about this second role, the delivery focus role. Let's talk about making it maybe the CEO seat. And that was kind of scary. That was like, okay, wow, we're going to make some big strides here.
Yeah. So it was a realization that you have a really strong but uneven skill set. You're really good at the visionary bit, seeing where the company can go and setting the foundation. But the integrator bit, making it happen at scale, is a totally different skill set.
Yeah, and also recognizing where your batteries get used the most. So when I am in the visionary seat, my battery levels go up. When I'm in the integrator seat, I can do it. But I get home at the end of the day and I'm like, it's grind. My batteries get really sapped. And so I was saying, if I'm going to do this for 5, 10, 15 more years, can I do it so that my batteries get recharged with the work I do rather than that feeling of depletion?
And it's so familiar to me personally, and I know many other founders out there, because the kind of work that you're describing, visionary versus operator, it's just really two different ways of working. They are quite different, and it's no surprise that one of them is exciting and another is depleting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Henrik, just to give a little bit of context to the situation, can you briefly describe where is the company today? Are we talking about 5 people or 5,000 people? And where do you see it going? Well, speaking of the visionary skill set, what's the vision? What's the potential? What's the future?
I love that. So right now, just to paint the picture of where we are about 35, 38 people next week. We are all based in the same headquarter here in West London, which has integrated lab facilities, some manufacturing, and offices. The company is just raised its Series A round last year with Octopus Ventures and PGF. And we have basically funded this plan, speaking of the future, that looks at expanding into the PFAS market space. So these forever chemicals. Forever chemicals have grown to become a significant lawsuit liability. So we have more than $200 billion of lawsuits active right now with $10 billion that have been settled. And so we're trying to own this market space, especially for the US. And then we're trying to use this bottom-up design feature that I talked about. It's basically like a tech process. So design, build, test, learn, where you can develop new materials, a bit like a drug discovery engine, for more stringent regulations. So there's a future-looking piece on what are the regulations going to be, what are customers having problems with that they still need to use, and also what are the technologies we can translate into our space. A lot of it comes from my sort of homeland or adjacent spaces in science, where it might be bioengineering or synthetic biology or supramolecular chemistry, these kind of wacko fields that actually people don't think fit well with the water treatment challenges. So the future really looks like expanding into buildings like where we are. We fund research with academics, so we go all the way to university, all the way to commercial deployment. So it's quite a wide space, and most people are not comfortable with all of it. The academics are too academic, the industrials are too corporate, which is quite fun. So the future-looking bit is building up these transdisciplinary teams. We are going to get to about 50 people at the end of next year. We've just joined the Tech Nation Upscale program, so we're going through that whole phase of transition from Series A to Series B.
Yeah. So really the vision is to build an organization that is equally good at research and implementation, that understands the fundamental science, but also can put it into practice at scale.
Exactly. And it's for me, it's a bit like Moderna going through the vaccine craze of the pandemic. They had to go from being an R&D organization to being a commercial entity with product sales. And product sales can then fund everything. That feedback loop is just super powerful.
Yeah. So let's rewind back into 2023. So you brought it to the board. Actually, can you say a little bit more about how did you approach the conversation with the board? Was it just in a board meeting, or did you start a off-the-record conversation with one of the board members?
I think one of the running themes now that I speak to the board with more context is I've always been very big on trying to bring them into the challenges. So I really have that sentiment that once they're on the table, we're all on the same side of the table, and I will overshare. I'll really get granular on the challenges, and then I'll mention in passing the benefit or the highlights we've had. And I do that around behaviors as well. So before board meetings, I have 30-minute one-to-one calls to hear what are their concerns, what are their worries, and then that shapes my agenda. And so in these one-on-one calls, I basically raised, hey, I'm going to be adding in some content around what I've been doing with the 360 feedback. I also shared the themes in the 360 feedback with them. So I was like, hey, these are the themes I see. This is what I think the company behaviors needs to change from. So I actually built a little slide that showed what my past behaviors were, what the behaviors are that the company needs to shift to, and being very clear, like, where is the delta and how do we overcome that delta? So rather than presenting a solution, oh, we're going to do this, it was like, here's the problem statement. Let's all agree really tightly on what the problem statement is. And we can then take the risk of reducing my battery levels by having me be integrator, or taking the risk of possible integration of other senior leaders who may step on other people's toes, or who may have things that are not quite what everybody was hoping. So I brought it up in one-to-one conversations, and then we had it at a board discussion, and it was fun. It's that sort of scary part of the comfort zone where you're moving between the safe green part to the scary red part, and you're in the orange. That's where you learn. That's where it gets interesting.
Yeah. And there are 3 things that really stand out for me here. One is that you chose to do a 360 review in the first place. And I know that not all leaders choose to. Then secondly, you chose to share it with the board. Again, instead of just reflecting on it privately, you share it with the board. And lastly, you framed it not as a solution and not in a personal terms that it's about you, but as a business problem. Here is what the business needs. Here is what we have. Here is the delta. How are we going to approach it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think the helpful part was also, the term sheet I took for the Series A. One of the things that was quite fun about it was the running theme of coaching. So we had that with the Kindred Capital group, and they encourage their founders. They even give a specific budget for it after they fund. Similarly, with the Series A lead, Octopus Ventures, one of the term sheet aspects is that they need you to take coaching as a founder. And so I used the coaching with my 360 feedback to say how we're going to present this to the board. Like, what's most useful? How can we make the most out of this valuable data that the team and the board members have shared?
So it was not just a one-off, it was really baked into your relationship with your investors.
Yeah.
So what happened next? Now that you moved into this orange risky zone of raising a difficult topic.
I had some wild parts of it. So I had really good input from our one of our early shareholders who had been involved from the very first venture round, and they were like, "Now is the time to lean into the relationships." So I would literally like fly out to some of our shareholders and spend a day with them and be like, "How are we gonna go through this?" And also talk about the other challenges, the big opportunity. And one of those meetings was really funny. I had a senior operator from one of our VCs join the session, and I presented this slide with the breakout of my role, and they just cut straight to the chase. They just said, "Hey, if you're gonna do that, like you're gonna be bringing in a CEO, they're gonna be hiring their own CFO, their own commercial officer, and then they're gonna own all of this bit." I was standing there, I took it and we talked about it. I said, okay, it's obviously not done yet, but I respected the perspective, and I like when people are very direct with me. Maybe it's the Danish part of me who just prefers to cut to the chase. And so I left that meeting. I then found out that this individual is specialized in being a professional CEO. So they've done it 4 times over with like several businesses. And so they could just see the pattern. And our partner at that firm then talked me through it and said, oh just take it easy, like we're not going to jump that gun. But I really appreciated that FaceTime together, because I can then see how investment committee members like that, they just see this theme whenever this comes up with their founders, and they're like, that's the route. And so even if you have other representatives from that investment committee, they will have this voice at their investment committee every time they bring it up. And you need to be aware of that. It's quite a strong perspective.
Yeah. So would it be fair to say that from your perspective, the situation looked like a combination of skill sets? There is a visionary skill set and there is a operator skill set or integrator skill set. But from a different position, different point of view, it looked like either you are doing everything as a CEO or you step aside and find someone else who is going to be responsible for all of it.
Exactly. Yeah. There's that sort of more traditional view versus this kind of more collaborative indexing view.
Yeah. And where did the journey take you from that point?
Yeah, so we're now in October, we're in November, and it took us a fair amount of effort. I'm Danish, so I underestimate. It took a huge amount of effort to find a good candidate for this seat. For things like this, you first search for the executive search firm, and then you negotiate, and then you sign something, because this is not cheap by any means. Once you've done that, then the real search begins. And so we basically ended up starting around January, February, and we maybe had 340 candidates in the short list. Market mapped the whole thing, the whole market for all of Europe, all of the US, for industrials, for water. And I set up this really helpful search committee at my board. So we had a search committee who represented both some of the talent experts at our VCs. So one of them used to work at like DeepMind and was much more of a talent partner than a VC. And that was a good voice to have. And then we would meet every week and we would go through, okay, what's the short list? What are we seeing in the market? What do we need more of? And I remember very, very explicitly, like there was this one session where We had seen some strong operators, but we were saying, okay, let's raise the bar once more. Let's go for the CEOs in these organizations. Even if they are like way bigger than us, let's try and go for those, because the timing was just ripe for this kind of PFAS was getting a lot of attention. And there were some changes happening in the market space with integrations of large corporates who have acquired one another. And so we came out of that, and out of that strong steer to go for more senior candidates, we started to see profiles that came up which were like, wow, they're applying for this.
And how do you think about the seniority in this situation? Because on the one hand, you've got still a relatively early stage startup, Series A, 38 people, even fewer when you started this search a year ago. But at the same time, you were aiming for really big heavyweights, people with some very serious experience in the industry.
Yeah, I think the big theme I saw was really, what are the tailwinds for the startup and how can that tie into the macro view? So we could tie in some of our tailwinds to the sustainability space, of course, but also to these lawsuits that were happening, which were unprecedented in our space. These lawsuits are once in a generation for the environmental material space in water. And all of the water companies see that, feel that, know that, hear that from their customers. And so there was a little bit of a stomach feeling, or like an intuition that maybe actually, if we do it now, we can get a better caliber candidate than if we wait another, 18 months until my energy batteries are really depleted. I've completed the Series B, and it'll be like, okay, now we definitely have to split your role up. So I think we tried to take a punt based on this feeling of there's good timing in the market space.
Yeah. So it sounds like there are two kinds of timing here. There is a timing in the market space, just a wider context, but there is also the timing of fundraising. You raised Series A last year and you're aiming for Series B next year. So the CEO change happened right in between two fundraising events.
Yeah, I would say I wanted to think about the inputs for this search process. And yeah, too many founders or startups, they get focused on the outputs, like, oh, what did we get out of it? Did we raise the money? Did we get the client? But the inputs from me are something I obsess on. And so I thought about this search process, and one of the inputs was, is whoever comes in going to have enough oxygen, i.e. capital, to deploy and build their plan before we go fundraise? And so that conversation with the board actually, again, took us to taking action. And in this case, we decided to do a Series A extension with some of the additional demand we have had for our Series A. And so in parallel with hiring the new CEO, I was also closing an equity round to make sure that when this CEO lands, there'll be freshly topped up capital that they can use to deploy, to get familiar before we need to go out and fundraise.
So really, you were doing two big things in parallel. The CEO search, interviewing lots of people, and fundraising to make sure that the new CEO has capital to deploy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It's a lot of fun as well. So it's like, yeah, there are running themes, and you can see I gain a lot of energy from doing these things that benefit the company. You can see a very clear benefit of getting it right. So, you know, in the end, we landed BGF, British Growth Fund. You know them well. And we basically had then the opportunity to bring them into some of the process, and they can say, hey, these are some of the candidates that we'd like you to meet. If you come in, like, we want them to feel on the same page as us with the opportunity and with who's coming in. And so it can work well because both are search processes. Both are bringing together what's going to be foundation for the company moving forward.
Yeah. This is actually a really interesting point. You were fundraising while at the same time being open with investors that a CEO transition is being planned. What was it like for you? Did it change the dynamic of the fundraising in any way?
I think the partnerships we had been speaking to for the Series A, I had been very open about how I wanted to expand and optimize the company for growth when we were running the process for the Series A itself. And so for the people that we brought in, we didn't bring everybody in to this. We were just like, okay, the people who had shown strong interest for the last round, let's speak to them. For most of them, it was a natural extension of the conversation we had had. So it didn't seem like a massive leap to say, okay, now they want to optimize for growth by doing this thing. They were like, okay, yeah, they were definitely open to it. And most of them came into it saying like, oh, it's nice to have, you don't have to do it. So like, we're interested on the basis of you not doing it. And I remember them presenting parallel cases to the investment committees, being like, okay, here's one scenario where they do it, and here's one scenario where they don't do it. Either case, we want to back this thing. And then it becomes that sort of feeling of you're working together rather than the antagonistic, like you're buying, we're selling, due diligence process that sometimes can be created.
Yeah. So the big takeaway, or the big thing I'm taking away from this is that you ran a fundraising process, and the fact that you were contemplating or preparing to change the CEO in the business did not get in the way, even though the company was still at a relatively early stage between Series A and Series B stage.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if we rewind a few months back, you said that you hired a search firm and formed a search committee to interview the candidates. Have you considered an internal candidate at any point, or did you go straight to an external one?
I think already when I presented some of the problem statement the year before, we were looking at what internal capability do we have. So I would actually do, how does the CEO need to change from R&D to commercial product entity, and how would the company need to change? And within that company change, we talked about what some of the big themes were. So like how the behaviors needed to change for the product team or for the commercial team, each one of them. And so as part of that, you really touch on, do we have internal capability that's very used to making this jump? And then maybe that can map up to the other column or the other role for the CEO role. And so we basically gave scores for each of the areas. And we did that blind. So the board did it, I did it, and then we got together. And that really then formed the basis of where are our strengths and where are our strengths talent pool wise. So that helped us touch on internal candidates without going through every single individual.
So you went through the exercise and effectively concluded that given your plans and given what you're looking for, you will need to go for an external one.
Yeah.
And how did you approach the search process? What was important for you in the selection process? Because you mentioned that 340 candidates on the list. It's a huge number of people to go through.
Yeah, it's a huge amount. I think the first big observation was we had codified our core values, and codifying our core values was really a tool that we use to make sure that the candidates coming in align with them. So they're very simple. It's like 4 core values. One is collaboration, other one is empathy, another one is taking initiative, another one is adaptable. And the combination of taking initiative with being compassionate, that bit, that's quite weird in the startup space. Most are taking initiative, like super indexed for performance, or some are indexed for like being very compassionate and like empathetic and not as much on the performance side. And so we saw a lot of interesting categories map onto different core values. And the way we summarized it to the search firm was really to get someone who's people first, as well as having the leadership, the strategy, and the technical capabilities. So there was like a capability mapping onto the role, and then there was this core values fit. It's really hard to then go through. Sometimes it's almost heartbreaking going out of a conversation where like, wow, they're just such a nice person, but they don't map onto both of the core values. Maybe they're super strong on the empathy or compassion, but they don't get as much of the taking initiative bit. And then you're almost building, for me, you're building network with these conversations. So I've now met people doing this process where I'm like, well, I'm going to definitely stay in touch with them. I'm going to be speaking to them. They're in our water space. They're in our interest space. And if they reached out afterwards, which they have, some of them I've met up with, I would try and help them, introduce them to people, and you're building rapport, which can be net positive for the company. This is actually like, it's expensive, but it is networking for the company with a very clear goal. So it's not just random networking. And we then started to see a whittling down where we're like, wow, this shortlist is some really strong people first candidates that each one of us as a search committee would love to work with. And it started to get hard to pick. We really had to get into the detail.
Yeah. So you used a data-driven approach that was ultimately grounded in values, combining things which are not quantifiable, but not just relying on your impression and gut feel, and ultimately trying to quantify the process as much as possible.
Yeah. Another big theme for this selection of the search firm was how they do the inclusive hiring. So, I sit on the diversity and inclusion steering group for the Royal Academy of Engineering Industry Leaders Group. And I do a lot of work trying to make sure we have good toolkits that make inclusive designs for teams available for all of the STEM sector in the UK. So we built a toolkit for it. We're doing stuff. And so we're really trying to implement those measures with the search. And so again, focusing on the inputs, one of the inputs we were very keen on was making sure that our exec search could bring up just a funnel that is balanced on some of the diversity metrics. So gender or ethnicity, some of that gender balance even coming through at the beginning was really important to us. Why I think it's important is we see that if you start with a funnel that's balanced and you run an inclusive process, the underrepresented candidates will make their way through the stages. That's the incredible thing. You don't need to say, oh, we only hire an underrepresented individual. No, just say at the beginning, let's have them at the table. And so the exec search firm we went with, they were really bought into it. They had a whole platform where they showed all of the metrics for this. And we can see at every stage what level were female, for example, for the recruitment process. And I was, delighted with having that embedded. It made it much easier for me as a founder to have buy-in to the process because the inputs that I care about were taken into consideration.
And I know that you used the psychometrics in your process. What was that like?
It's I think psychometrics for many become a bit scary. They're like, oh no, what are they gonna dig out from from my behaviors that I don't want to show? One of our inclusive recruitment initiatives has been to have psychometrics for all candidates that we land. So if you meet any one of the 30, 40 people in Puraffinity, they will have done psychometrics as part of their recruitment process. And we thought about how to take that up a notch for the CEO role. So we got an introduction through my coach who helped us run this independently. So a third party, I didn't have a relationship with them, neither did anybody else, but we trusted them and they're a real expert. And then, they did the psychometrics, they did the debrief with the candidates, they gave a report to us and then did a debrief with us. So it's a lot of legwork, but you really gain these insights, a bit like the 360 feedback. You see themes. It's not about the concrete answer. It's more about okay, what are the themes that show up? Some people index more on performance. And then it's about what happens when you overextend that strength. Maybe they burn out the whole team. Okay, what can we do to mitigate that risk? So I think for us as an executive search process, it was about embedding that into the risk taking that we're willing to take on and then mitigating for those risks, not to just let them happen if we pick a candidate.
Yeah. So again, paying attention to values and behaviors, things which are difficult to quantify, but ultimately trying to make the process as data-driven as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you zero in on the successful candidate?
It was quite fun to zero in on the candidate. I think we had approached them once, and then they were like responding a little bit, and then we approached them again after this strong steer to go for CEO candidates, and we got some bite. So we had the benefit there of being able to introduce very senior candidates to the process, and then they made it through the stages. And I think afterwards, I reflected on it a bit. For some candidates, you only get one shot. You have one 30-minute call. If you blow that one, it's done. They're not going to hang around. They're not going to take a second call. It's like, that's the chance. And so the craft through the fundraising and through the other conversation had been honed. You've basically been using these interviews as a battleground to test, how do we convey what's happening? How do we convey what we want to do? And answer some of the questions that are uncomfortable. Like, what are you going to do? If you're hiring your successor, what the hell are you going to be adding value to? We had answered many of those things. And so they came into the process, went from one stage to another stage, and I could tell the excitement. It was like palpable for some of the people in the search. Of course, the other candidates were great, but you have someone like this moving through to the final stage, going through the behavioral stage and still being very like people first and strong value alignment. Then I started to, I got excited, of course, but the others, sometimes I think you will find that your search committee members can get carried away with someone, and they'll just ask like, how's the process with this candidate going? And they, obviously it worked out in our case, which is wonderful. But I think just give a bit of caution not to get too carried away with candidates.
Yeah. So it sounds like your effort, the investment of so much time to go through so many candidates and interview them so extensively really paid off. You found the candidate that everyone was excited about.
Yeah, found two actually. So we had a very strong final shortlist. And even with a candidate like the one we've gone for, there was strong competition, which is pretty cool. It's very nice to have that feeling of, okay, you're making an active choice rather than you're picking whoever remains after a long battle.
Yeah. And then the new candidate became the CEO a couple of months ago, you said, right?
7th of September.
Yeah, 7th of September. So what was the handover like?
That was full on. So I think I spent 2-3 months preparing handover stuff. And I was always trying to start the handover softly before. So if I could like introduce to some stakeholder, introduce to some individuals, then I would. But most summers get busy. The candidate might be traveling. On our side, there might be holidays, so hard to schedule things. So I basically had 1 week where I recruited and onboarded a CEO on Tuesday, a CTO on Wednesday, and a CFO on Thursday. That's it, 1 week. So again, there's a theme of parallelizing activities.
Okay.
So I could basically onboard and hand over to CEO for many things, to CTO for many things, and to CFO for some other aspects. And it became like parallel work streams where I could reuse some material. Say, okay, this is the company, these are our values. Here is the work stream, the button I can press for talking to our people and talent lead, talking to our finance specialist, and getting them up to speed on everything in that function.
Yeah, but there is something interesting here. So the company changed not just the CEO, but also CTO and CFO in the same week.
Yeah.
Apart from it being a lot of work, understandably.
Yeah.
How did you approach the choice of the senior management team, given that the CEO was changing at the same time? Because normally the senior team is formed by the CEO, and I noticed that there were extensive changes on the senior team right at the moment when the CEO was also replaced.
Yeah, it was a lot of preparation, I would say. So at least for the CTO, the team knew it for a while. There was a long notice period. They were getting ready to come and join. It's not easy for the team to go through some of these change programs that really hiring someone senior for the company is. So we brought in a change management expert who helped to talk to people, to be involved when there are individuals who are very scientifically strong, maybe very analytical, and seeing a lot of process change is not their comfort zone. So we got individual support from this change expert, and then we also did some team time. So we actually had a session in July, which was high risk. I will give you that. 2 full days, strategy days with the new CTO, the new CEO, 2 months before they start. That was super fun. It was very trust building. Half of it was trust building exercises, so vulnerabilities, and also focusing on then the behaviors of the company, talking about how the last quarter went, how the next year is going to be. And we had an external facilitator for it. Of course, these things are risky. So I remember thinking, wow, we're going to pull this off. It's going to be one for the history books. But we decided to go for it. It's again, we index a lot for collaboration and transparency. So bringing them in that early was part of saying, these are all of our issues. These are the problem statements. And making sure that they really feel like, what would it be like being on the same side of the table? And so in a sense, that helped ease the onboarding. They were already up to speed on what were the issues. And then I would use one of the tips from your book to basically write them emails after that to say, this has gone wrong a bit more, or this is getting more of an issue. And they got that sort of flow of information, because a lot happens in 2 months. Many things change in a startup.
Yeah. And what happened to your own role? So you stepped down as a CEO 2 months ago. What are you doing now?
I think the short version of it, I have done like a Sergey Brin. He moved from being CEO to being the head of product. I've done a similar thing. So I'm the chief product and innovation officer at Puraffinity. I get to do so much of the fun stuff that gives me energy, and a lot less of the things that deplete my battery levels. And I've been able to do them for 9+ years, but I don't have to do them every day. So I lead on partnerships, big partnerships. I lead on technology roadmap, long term, and product roadmap. I still am heavily involved with fundraising, and then also with talent. I do some brand speaking as well for our partnerships. So we'll go and do white papers, or we'll present at conferences. And then basically I sit down with the new CEO candidate and say, what are the deliverables we need from, let's say I'm the chief product and innovation officer, for the next 3, 6, 12 months. We do that every 6 months. So we've done it once, we're checking into it. And every time we'll see what job title it maps onto. It'll be somewhere within that product and innovation space, but the deliverables can vary quite a lot.
Yeah. And what is it like for you, just on a human level, to go through this change, away from that top role in the company, away from the status of being a CEO? What was it like?
I think for me as a founder, I almost feel guilty pleasure at times about how nice it is, the world that I've sort of now created for myself in this new role. I think as an individual, as a founder, it's very natural to get a lot of our identity overlapping with being a founder, with being a CEO. And I think I was very deliberate about having several identities that I've built up. So there is Henrik, the martial artist, the massage expert, the husband, the long distance cyclist, the adventurer. There is the CEO, there is the founder, there is the scientist, there is the engineer, and all of these contribute something. But I am not that identity. I know that I operate in that identity. And so if you dislodge a very big part of it, like let's say the CEO was a part of it, you can almost feel like everything slips. And so as part of this process, I was saying to myself, doing coaching or journaling, like, what are the other identities I can lean into now so that I feel less dislodged when it happens? And honestly, that's been really helpful. I've been leaning into my husband part. It's like, okay, how can I be there for my wife and spending time with her? I've been leaning into my adventure side. So I set up my long distance cycle trip with my dad. my long distance swimming trip with my wife, like in this wild ocean. And even though it might sound like distraction, it's really thinking about the input for this process is how attached I am to that identity. So doing meditation and leaning into the other identities really helped me feel the energy level about it, less so than the scariness, which is obviously present as well, but not as strong.
Yeah. So again, it sounds like there is an important lesson here, not to invest the entire sense of self into one identity of the founder CEO, but instead recognize that life is complex, diverse, that there are different aspects of your life, and being a CEO is just one part of your experience and not the entirety of it.
Yeah, I think there's also a theme that, I sit in these founder support groups, and it's natural to get your identity overlapping with the CEO seat. And I don't fight it all the time. For 5 years, I wasn't thinking about leaning out of that role so much because I was just like, this is what I have to do. But when it comes up, like these feelers that, oh, maybe in the next 2 years or 5 years, it'll be less, then it's like, okay, coming off the gas a little bit and giving yourself that room to not only just be like seen as the CEO all the time, let's be seen as the husband, let's be seen as the martial artist or whichever other ones you have.
Yeah, because all of us have multiple identities. It's
Yeah.
not just work. It's not just what we do right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Henrik, looking back, if you think about the last 18 months between you first thinking about the implications of your 360 to today, where a new person is running the company that you founded, what would you do differently?
I think there is always a tendency towards trying to analyze the situation and do as thorough of a job as possible for me. And so it would be to try and reduce that phase of analyzing and preparation for the process and moving more towards having some of those early conversations with scenarios that are concrete. So it's like 18 months ago, I could have said, okay, maybe this means that in one case, I'm still the CEO, or in another case, I am not the CEO, and then something in between. And bringing that to the table in a non-hostile way, where you're just looking at scenarios on the map, you're still on the same side of the table, that can take some of the tension out when you do then go for a scenario where you're no longer the CEO. Because no matter how well you prepare, all sorts of weird feelings kick in, and you're just like, wow, okay, this is kind of big. Like my body is responding to it, or it's like attaches to this experiential knowledge of doing something. Versus theoretically, I could say, oh yeah, that's a scenario, easy peasy. So I would probably have those conversations, looking at the scenarios early on and trying to be more explicit about what those scenarios look like.
Yeah. So thinking it through instead of just focusing on one scenario or one version of the future.
Yeah.
That you had in mind. And you also mentioned working with your emotions, not just looking at it objectively as a scientist, but also noting how your body responds to it. What does it feel like to contemplate different options for the future?
Yeah, I think that was a big learning through this. So learning to view emotions and feelings like valuable data points. And I know I'm butchering so many things by putting it across that way, but that's the approach I take. So I will observe, like just lean into paying attention to it. So the feelings might show up as I don't know, sometimes an excited stomach feeling, or sometimes a cautious pulling of the neck, and trying to notice and pay attention to what is this interesting data point that I can learn from, and how can that influence what decisions we take for how to run this process.
Yeah, so really listening to your body and not only to the rational logical arguments.
Yeah.
And Henrik, when you think about the next 2, 5, 10 years, a long-term perspective, how do you think about your future? Do you want to stay with Puraffinity for as long as it takes, or start another business, or do something completely different?
I think the ideal scenario, and I get asked this a lot, it's still raw, but it's interesting. The ideal scenario for me is building Puraffinity up to a stage where I can found and incubate things within the beast, that the institution that's becoming Puraffinity. And so I can do that in this product and technology roadmap space, and I can bring that 3-year vision into the day to day now and incubate it and breed it up. That's really what I love doing, and I can see myself doing that for several years moving forward. It's sort of leaning into the best of what I've learned without having to do all the terrible, well, not terrible, the painstaking bits, like running 5 things in parallel, fundraising, recruitment, and everything else. I think there's also something around me getting frustrated with the UK and EU ecosystem, that we're very good at founding things, but scaling them and building them into genuine institutions much larger than their founders is still a challenge. And I would love to lean into that. I would love to try and get that part of the puzzle going, where then the product revenue starts to be a cash flow growth engine for the rest of the institution. That's something I would love to build for the venture. And I don't think we've seen many examples of that in the UK ecosystem. Most of them, they stay on the venture circuit, they need more funding, and then they get bought up. So trying to build that would be fun. It's kind of new space for this ecosystem, and it's a realm I would love to operate in.
And there are so many people who talk about this problem, recognizing that founding a business and taking a startup to a certain stage is one thing, but actually having the infrastructure to take the business to a global scale is a totally different thing that the UK and Europe are maybe not great at just yet.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And when you think about the advice you would like to share with founders who might be in your situation 18 months or 2 years ago, who are running their businesses and maybe a similar stage, similar size, and they might be looking at their own 360 results and contemplating the shape of their skill set.
I think right now we have a lot of information in this world, and the hard thing is really to try and ask the question and to have the courage to share the problem statement. So I would actually, quite funnily, I would ask them not to ask for advice, but to be really clear on what they think the problem statement is. To be really clear on what is the question we're trying to ask, not what is the answer, not what is the advice that the people around them want to give, but what is really that one question that summarizes the challenge here. And most people in that search process get uncomfortable. And so I would suggest to lean into that discomfort. That's where the interesting growth happens. That's where insights really come out. If you lean into that, doing a CEO transition can be a big personal development opportunity. It's uncomfortable, I will give you that. It's a bit like a divorce can be a personal development opportunity. But if you lean into it, if you see these things, this discomfort as an interesting teacher, then you can learn a lot from it. And I've definitely seen founders who have learned a lot from it, including yourself. And I think that can be a very liberating part. Otherwise, it can feel like you're just stuck into a situation, don't really want to do this, and it's just something that others are forcing onto you.
Yeah. So in other words, instead of trying to figure out how to stay as a CEO forever, try to figure out what is there to learn, what is the right question to ask, and how can the situation be an opportunity for personal growth.
Yeah, yeah. While giving yourself space. Now, of course, this is hard, and don't expect to be happy every single day. Like, you don't have to go in and say, oh, what a wonderful learning opportunity for every single meeting. Just say, oh, this is sapping a lot of energy from me, and I'm doing it, but today is not the easiest day.
Yeah. And speaking of this is actually a really interesting point. How would you describe the difference between the parts of the CEO job that are not easier and sometimes actually quite difficult because it is a challenging job in many ways, and recognizing that it doesn't give you energy, that it's not just difficult, it's not just a bad day at work, it's something which you should not be doing or don't want to be doing for the next 10 years? Where is the line in your experience?
That's a very good question. I have somewhat of an answer, and it's not the perfect one. I'm still working on that bit. I think one is seeing too long themes of depleted energy levels. So in our founder support groups, we see some founders, and after 2, 3, 4 sessions, and the other founders are asking the same questions, and your scores are still not very high. If you go for a founder support group, then it starts to become a question of like maybe pulling one of them aside and being like comparing notes. Do you also get depleted at work like I do, or is this more out of the norm? Then is it more systemic than just an incident? And other founders are really candid. They can really, they will just give it to you straight. I think that's one way that I try and work it out. The other bit is there will always be themes that are hardest for you. So for my wife, she always jokes that when the technology goes wrong, I'm super comfortable with it. Oh yeah, But when I have to change the team, it's super difficult for me. It's like, oh my God, I love these people. I admire them. I care about them. And that's really brutal for me. And so just knowing which topics are hardest for you as an incident can also be useful because they will not be forever. It'll just be like a standalone incident.
Yeah. So really self-awareness and being part of a community, putting your own experience in the context of what other people are going through.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Henrik, as we're preparing to start wrapping up our conversation today, is there anything else you would like to share with those listening or watching our conversation?
I think it's to look at this as a wild process, that it's a bit like a beast. If you can tame this beast, you can reap a lot of benefits. And most people get scared when they see a big unwieldy beast. Just trying to break it down into its individual components and giving ourselves space to feel the feelings that come with it. And having that compassion flow into ourselves, from ourselves, can be really empowering during a high intensity process like this.
Yeah. So really having a plan, taking it step by step, acknowledging the feelings, and still moving forward.
Yeah, taking action. And that's where the energy comes from. So that sort of action bias really gives a lot of joy to doing something like this.
Yeah. Henrik, thank you so much for the conversation. I'm sure it will be both interesting and useful to so many people listening to this.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Such a pleasure. Thank you, Evgeny.
Yeah, really appreciate your time. To wrap up our conversation, I would like to highlight a few points. The first one is how Henrik framed different parts of his skill set. He's really good at visionary bits. This is why he founded the company and led it over the last 10 years. But what the company needs over the next decade is the integrator skill set. That is scaling, optimizing structures, processes, and all the things that help the business operate on a bigger scale. And that's not what gives him energy, as he openly admitted with a lot of self-awareness. And I think Henrik really deserves credit for bringing this situation to the board in a very open and self-aware way, framing it as the company challenge, something that the board needs to address for the sake of the business instead of making it some personal, existential, philosophical choice about him. And while it might be a bit premature to judge the long-term consequences of this transition because it only happened 2 months ago, I think it's fair to say that with the benefit of hindsight, this transition was approached in a very adult and mature way by all parties. They took a responsible decision, they had enough time to execute it, they worked really, really hard to select the best candidates out of hundreds of potential applicants, and eventually they made an appointment they are proud of. I hope you found this conversation useful and interesting. Please don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you're watching or listening to this conversation, and speak to you soon.